The courtroom was filled with murmurs as the doors swung open, and all eyes turned toward the young man stepping inside. Noah Reynolds, an 18-year-old from a struggling neighborhood, clutched a worn leather briefcase in one hand while tugging at the oversized blazer hanging loosely from his shoulders with the other. His sneakers barely made a sound against the polished floor, but the hushed whispers carried the weight of doubt and curiosity. Judge Harrison, adjusting his glasses and looking Noah up and down with barely concealed disdain. "Are you sure you're in the right place, son? This isn't a school debate club. You do realize this is a courtroom, correct?" Noah Reynolds, his voice steady. "Yes, Your Honor. I'm fully aware." Judge Harrison, smirking, leaning back in his chair. "Well, that's surprising. I figured you got lost on your way to, wherever it is boys like you spend their time these days." Martin West, the opposing attorney, an older white man in a tailored suit, shakes his head with exaggerated amusement. "Your Honor, I must admit, this is a first for me. I've argued against Ivy League graduates, corporate sharks, and legal prodigies, but never, gesturing toward Noah with a smirk, against a street kid playing dress-up." Laughter erupts from the spectators. Even some of the jurors exchange glances, smirks tugging at their lips. Judge Harrison, feigning seriousness, tapping his gavel lightly. "Order, order. Let's not be cruel, Mr. West. We must allow the young man to make a fool of himself properly." Martin West, chuckling, nodding. "Of course, Your Honor. Far be it from me to interrupt his aspirations." Noah Reynolds, steeling himself, gripping the table's edge. "I'm not here to play games, Your Honor. I'm here to defend my mother." The laughter dies down slightly, but the smirks remain. Judge Harrison raises an eyebrow, pretending to be intrigued. Judge Harrison, mocking surprise. "Well, well. Defend your mother, you say? And what prestigious law school did you graduate from, Mr. Reynolds?" Martin West, leaning forward, interjecting with a smirk. "Oh, Your Honor, I'm sure we missed the grand announcement of Reynolds and Associates opening its doors in the back of some liquor store." More laughter. A few people in the audience whisper, shaking their heads. One juror, a middle-aged man with graying hair, rolls his eyes as if this is all beneath his attention. Noah Reynolds, ignoring the insults, keeping his voice firm. "I may not have a law degree, but I've spent every waking hour studying this case. I know the facts, and I know my mother is innocent." Judge Harrison, scoffing, flipping through a file. "Innocent, you say? That's quite the claim. And how exactly do you plan on proving that, boy?" Noah Reynolds, jaw tightening, but refusing to let the insult shake him. "With evidence, Your Honor. And with the truth." Martin West, snorting, exchanging a glance with the judge. "The truth? That's adorable. Let me ask you something, kid, do you even know how to submit a motion? How to cross-examine a witness? Or are you planning to stand up there and cry about injustice while we handle the real work?" Another round of laughter. Noah's fingers curl into fists at his sides, but he forces himself to remain composed. This is exactly what they want, to break him before he even starts. Judge Harrison, feigning patience. "I'll humor you, Mr. Reynolds. Let's assume, for one ridiculous moment, that you're capable of defending your mother. Tell me, do you understand the gravity of this situation? If you fail, she goes to prison for life. You'll ruin whatever future she has left, and when this is all over, you'll walk out of here with nothing but embarrassment. You'll be the kid who thought he could play lawyer in the big leagues and lost everything. Do you really want that?" Noah Reynolds, holding his ground, voice unwavering. "The only thing worse than failing is not trying. Martin West, sighing dramatically, rubbing his temples. All right, let's get this over with, then. Let's see how the prodigy from the projects plans to outmaneuver a legal team with a combined experience of over 70 years. Judge Harrison, grinning as if entertained by a circus act. This ought to be entertaining. Proceed, Mr. Reynolds. Show us what you've got. Noah steps forward, placing his worn leather briefcase on the table. The laughter and whispers fade slightly as he opens it, pulling out neatly organized documents and handwritten notes. There's a moment, a flicker, where even the judge hesitates, as if surprised by Noah's preparation. But then the smirk returns. Judge Harrison, sighing, gesturing dismissively. Well, let's get on with it before we waste any more time. Martin West, grinning smugly. Yes, I'd love to see how a self-taught, barely legal adult thinks he can outmatch me. Maybe you can start by explaining why this entire defense isn't just a desperate, pathetic stunt. Noah Reynolds, calmly, holding up a file. For starters, Mr. West, I'd like to submit this, a financial report proving that the funds my mother was accused of stealing never actually left the account in question. A pause. Judge Harrison frowns slightly. West narrows his eyes, shifting in his seat. Judge Harrison, skeptical, but slightly less amused. And where exactly did you get this? Noah Reynolds, unfolding another document. Bank records. Publicly accessible, if you know where to look. I cross-referenced the statements with internal payroll receipts from my mother's employer. It proves there was a miscalculation in the original audit, which led to an incorrect accusation. Martin West, leaning forward, irritation creeping into his voice. And you expect us to take your word for it? Noah Reynolds, holding up another document. No. I expect you to take the word of the forensic accountant I consulted, who verified my findings and signed this affidavit. Silence. The once smirking jury members sit up slightly. The bailiff glances at the judge, sensing the shift in the room. Judge Harrison, clears throat, shifting slightly in his seat. We'll see about that. Martin West, glaring, no longer amused. All right, kid. You've got my attention. But don't think for a second that means you're winning this case. Noah Reynolds, meeting his gaze, voice unwavering. We'll see about that. The courtroom, once filled with laughter and mockery, now simmers with something different. The game is changing. And for the first time, Noah isn't just a kid playing dress-up. He's a contender. Lisa Reynolds had always known struggle. It was a constant, lurking presence in her life, but she had learned to live with it, enduring long hours scrubbing floors, stretching every dollar, and sacrificing sleep just to keep food on the table for her son. Yet nothing had prepared her for the cold, sinking dread that gripped her when she saw the eviction notice pinned to their apartment door. Her hands trembled as she reached for the paper, her eyes scanning the bold, unfeeling words. Notice of eviction. Tenants must vacate the premises within 7 days. Failure to comply will result in forced removal. Lisa's breath hitched. A cold sweat formed at the back of her neck as she reread the notice, her vision blurring at the edges. This couldn't be right. She had paid the rent, every cent of it, just like she always did. She had the receipts, the bank statements, the proof. But none of that seemed to matter now. She stumbled back a step, her legs suddenly weak beneath her. Her home, the only place she had fought so hard to keep, where she had tucked Noah in at night, where she had spent countless evenings cooking dinner with whatever scraps she could afford, was being taken away. Just like that. Noah. Her voice came out shakier than she intended. She turned toward the apartment, where her son sat at the kitchen table, hunched over his textbooks. When he looked up and saw her expression, his brow furrowed. "What's wrong?" he asked, rising to his feet. Lisa swallowed the lump in her throat and forced herself to speak. It's an eviction notice," she whispered, holding the paper out to him. "They say we have 7 days." Noah snatched the document from her hands, his eyes darting across the text. His jaw tightened, and his fingers curled around the edges of the notice. "But that doesn't make sense," he muttered. "You paid this month's rent." "I did," Lisa said, sinking into a chair. "I don't understand. I always pay on time." Her voice cracked as fear settled deep in her bones. "I don't have anywhere else to go, Noah." Noah's expression darkened, his usual boyish features hardening into something more determined, more fierce. "They're trying to cheat us," he said firmly. "I'll figure this out." Lisa shook her head, a defeated sigh escaping her lips. "Noah, people like us don't win these fights. They always find a way to take everything, no matter how hard we try." But Noah didn't look convinced. He looked angry. And more than that, he looked ready to fight. As Lisa watched him grip the notice, eyes burning with resolve, she felt something strange stir within her fear. A spark of hope. Maybe, just maybe, her son was right. The courtroom was thick with tension. The air, once filled with amusement at the young, self-taught legal advocate, had shifted. Noah Reynolds had just delivered a crushing argument, exposing the fraudulent eviction notice and the landlord's history of illegal practices. Now, the attention had shifted to the judge and the opposing counsel, Martin West, a man who was not accustomed to losing, especially not to an 18-year-old with no law degree. West stood, his chair scraping loudly against the polished floor, and adjusted his tie, forcing an air of confidence he no longer truly felt. "Your Honor," he began, his voice controlled but edged with irritation, "this is absurd. We are seriously entertaining the notion that a high school student, who has never spent a day in law school, is capable of dismantling an entire legal process based on a technicality." Judge Harrison raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "Are you contesting the evidence, Mr. West?" West let out a short, hollow laugh. "I am contesting the very notion that this court would allow such theatrics. What we have here is nothing more than a desperate attempt to delay an eviction that was perfectly within legal bounds." Noah spoke up, his voice clear and firm. "Your Honor, I have provided documented proof that the eviction notice was signed by a notary who retired 2 years before it was issued. That alone makes it invalid under state law." West turned sharply to face Noah. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "You think you can interpret the law better than someone who has spent decades practicing it?" Noah held his ground. "I don't need decades. I just need the truth." West clenched his jaw and turned back to Judge Harrison. "Your Honor, if we allow this case to proceed, we are setting a dangerous precedent. Are we now to assume that every piece of minor clerical oversight is grounds to overturn legal proceedings?" Judge Harrison tapped his gavel lightly. "Clerical oversight, Mr. West. Fraud is not a clerical oversight." West's face reddened. The eviction was lawful. A technical flaw in the paperwork does not change the fact that the defendant failed to meet her rental obligations. Noah interjected, his voice rising. "That is a blatant misrepresentation, Mr. West. My mother paid every cent of her rent, and we have the bank statements to prove it. What she received was not a legal eviction notice, it was an attempt to force us out through deception." The murmurs in the courtroom grew louder. The jurors, once dismissive, were now watching intently. Judge Harrison leaned forward slightly, his tone sharp. "Mr. West, let's clarify something right now. Are you arguing that an eviction notice signed by an unauthorized notary is still legally binding? West hesitated, his lips pressing into a thin line. I am arguing, he said finally, that in cases like this, procedural missteps should not render an entire eviction void. Tenants have been removed under far less disputable circumstances. Noah stepped closer. The law is clear, Your Honor. If the notice itself is fraudulent, then the entire process built on it is void. Mr. West would have you believe that bending the law in favor of landlords is just an oversight, while ignoring the real issue, landlords exploiting vulnerable tenants who don't have the resources to fight back. West whirled on him. You are not a lawyer, Reynolds, he snapped. You don't get to stand here and lecture me about legal ethics. Judge Harrison's eyes darkened. Mr. West, he said, his tone carrying a warning. You will conduct yourself professionally in this courtroom. West gritted his teeth, inhaling sharply through his nose before turning back to the judge. Apologies, Your Honor. But surely you see what's happening here. This is a game, one meant to stall an inevitable ruling. If we overturn this eviction, what happens next? A flood of amateur legal defenses from people who suddenly believe they can challenge their landlords based on trivialities. Judge Harrison exhaled, his patience thinning. So, your argument is that a legal technicality should only matter when it favors your client? West's mouth opened, then closed. His silence stretched just a second too long. Noah seized the moment. Your Honor, if the roles were reversed, if a tenant had tried to submit a lease renewal signed by an invalid notary, do you think for 1 second Mr. West's client would have accepted it? No, they would have laughed, torn it up, and evicted them anyway. The law should apply equally, no matter how inconvenient it is for the wealthy and powerful. The courtroom was dead silent. Even the most skeptical jurors now seemed to be reconsidering their initial assumptions. West's face darkened, but he refused to let the case slip from his grasp. Your Honor, he said, forcing himself to sound composed, I ask that we move past this nonsense and return to the facts. The defendant failed to pay rent. No, Noah interrupted sharply. She did pay. And I have the receipts to prove it. Noah reached into his binder, pulling out a neatly organized file of payment records. He walked toward the bench and handed it to the bailiff, who delivered it to Judge Harrison. The judge scanned the documents, his expression unreadable. West crossed his arms. Even if she paid, that does not invalidate the eviction process. Noah's voice was unwavering. No, but fraud does. Judge Harrison placed the documents down carefully. He tapped his fingers against the bench, his expression unreadable. Mr. West, he said slowly, do you have any counter-evidence proving that these payments were not made? Or do you stand by your claim that the eviction was lawful? West hesitated. That moment of hesitation was enough. Noah's heart pounded. He had him cornered. The judge exhaled, rubbing his temple before straightening. The law is not a one-way street, Mr. West. It does not only exist to benefit landlords while punishing tenants for daring to challenge them. The evidence presented today, he gestured toward the fraudulent eviction notice, the payment records, the signed affidavits from other victims of the landlord's practices, paints a troubling picture. And unless you have any further evidence to support your claim that this eviction was lawful, then this court has no choice but to rule in favor of the defendant. West's jaw tightened. He had nothing. Judge Harrison's gaze settled on him, steady and unyielding. Do you have any final arguments, counselor? A long silence stretched between them. Finally, with visible effort, Martin West unclenched his jaw and shook his head. No, Your Honor. Noah felt his knees go weak. Judge Harrison picked up his gavel. Then this court rules in favor of the defendant, Lisa Reynolds. The eviction notice is declared invalid, and the plaintiff is ordered to compensate the Reynolds family for wrongful eviction and emotional distress. The gavel slammed down. The courtroom erupted. Lisa let out a sharp, choked breath, her hand covering her mouth. Noah barely had time to register her pulling him into a tight embrace before reporters began whispering, spectators murmuring. West sat back down, staring blankly at the table. His case, his arrogance, had been dismantled by a boy who had never set foot in law school. Noah stepped back, breathing deeply, steadying himself. They had won. And in that moment, he realized, this was only the beginning. A hush fell over the courtroom as Judge Harrison's final words settled over the room. For a moment, there was only silence, thick, heavy, filled with the weight of what had just transpired. Then, slowly, a few quiet claps echoed from the gallery. At first, they were hesitant, uncertain. But then, as the reality of Noah's victory set in, the applause grew louder, spreading through the room like a rising tide. People who had once looked at him with amusement or outright dismissal were now standing, clapping, nodding in respect. Jurors who had exchanged skeptical glances at the beginning of the trial now whispered to one another, their faces filled with admiration. Even the bailiff, who had remained neutral throughout the proceedings, gave Noah an approving nod. Lisa gasped, her hands flying to her face as tears streamed freely down her cheeks. Her body shook with emotion as she turned to her son, who was still standing at the defense table, stunned but victorious. "You did it," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You really did it." Noah turned to her, his own eyes glassy with emotion. "We did it, Mom," he murmured, stepping forward. Lisa didn't hesitate, she threw her arms around him, holding him as if she would never let go. The courtroom was alive now, people murmuring, reporters quickly scribbling down notes, cameras flashing as journalists captured the moment. Some of the spectators had started cheering, their voices rising in support. "That kid just out-argued a professional lawyer. I can't believe it, he actually won. A self-taught legal mind, incredible." Among the murmurs, a deep, steady voice cut through the noise. "Mr. Reynolds." Noah turned to see Judge Harrison stepping down from the bench. The once imposing figure now stood directly before him, his face devoid of the smug condescension he had worn earlier. Instead, his expression was one of quiet respect. The room fell silent again as everyone turned to watch. The judge extended his hand. "I owe you an apology." Noah blinked, momentarily caught off guard. Judge Harrison continued. "When you walked into my courtroom, I misjudged you. I assumed you were wasting my time, that you were nothing more than an overconfident young man in over his head. But today, you reminded me of something important. Justice isn't about age, background, or even experience. It's about truth. And you, Mr. Reynolds, fought for the truth with more courage than many seasoned attorneys I've seen in my years on the bench." A murmur of approval spread through the room. Noah, still processing, slowly extended his hand and shook the judge's. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside him. Judge Harrison nodded. "If you ever decide to pursue law, I'd be honored to write your first letter of recommendation." Lisa gasped again, her hands flying to her mouth as fresh tears welled in her eyes. The murmurs in the gallery turned into a roar, journalists whispering excitedly, people turning to one another in disbelief. Reporters surged forward, microphones and cameras trained on Noah. "Noah Reynolds. How does it feel to have? He won against a veteran attorney without any formal training. Do you plan on becoming a lawyer after this?" How did you manage to take on this case and succeed? Noah hesitated, glancing at his mother. She looked at him with nothing but pride, her eyes silently telling him, "You did this. You deserve to answer." Taking a deep breath, Noah turned to the reporters. "It was never about proving myself," he said, his voice calm but firm. "It was about proving that people like my mother, like so many others, deserve justice, even when the system is stacked against them. Laws exist to protect everyone, not just those who can afford expensive lawyers. If no one else was going to fight for her, I had to." The room fell silent again for just a moment, then came the clicking of cameras, the murmurs of approval, the scattered applause growing into a wave of cheers. A middle-aged man in the gallery, dressed in a modest work uniform, stepped forward hesitantly. "My landlord's been trying to push me out too," he said, his voice quiet but hopeful. Do you think you could help?" Noah looked at him, then at the others who had gathered, their expressions shifting from admiration to something else, hope. Lisa squeezed his hand. "Noah," she whispered, "I don't think this is the last time you'll be in a courtroom." He exhaled, a small smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "Maybe not," he admitted. As they made their way outside, the cold air greeted them, but it no longer carried the weight of fear and uncertainty. Instead, it was crisp, fresh, like a new beginning. The second they stepped onto the courthouse steps, they were met with cheers. A small crowd of neighbors, friends, and even strangers had gathered, waiting to hear the outcome. The moment they saw Lisa and Noah step outside, victorious, a loud roar erupted. "You did it, kid. Noah, the lawyer of the people." A woman from their apartment building rushed forward, holding out a warm loaf of fresh bread. "For celebrating," she said warmly. "You both deserve it." Lisa accepted it with shaking hands, her eyes welling up yet again. "Thank you," she whispered. People patted Noah on the back, shook his hand, praised him. He had walked into that courtroom as a kid no one took seriously, and he walked out as something more, a symbol of resilience, of defiance in the face of injustice. And yet, as he looked around at the smiling faces, at his mother clutching the eviction notice that no longer held power over them, he realized something. This wasn't just about them anymore. If he could do this once, he could do it again. Not just for his mother, but for every person who had ever been told they didn't have a chance. He turned to Lisa, who looked at him with nothing but love and pride. "Let's go home, Mom," he said, his voice filled with something new, something unshakable. Not just confidence. Purpose. And as they walked away, hand in hand, no one knew this was just the beginning. The birth of a future lawyer. The echo of Judge Harrison's gavel lingered in the air like a final, decisive note of victory. The courtroom, once filled with hushed whispers of doubt and quiet scoffs of amusement, erupted into applause. It was hesitant at first, small claps from a few jurors, an approving nod from the bailiff, but then, like a wave building momentum, it spread. Spectators rose from their seats, journalists leaned forward with eager pens and flashing cameras, and even those who had initially dismissed Noah Reynolds as nothing more than a foolish boy stood in admiration. Lisa gasped, covering her face with trembling hands as fresh tears streamed down her cheeks. The weight of months of uncertainty, fear, and hopelessness lifted from her shoulders all at once. Her knees buckled slightly, but before she could collapse under the sheer force of relief, she rushed toward her son, her arms flinging around him. "You did it," she sobbed against his shoulder. "You really did it." Noah held her tightly, his own breath shaky, his heart still racing. "We did it, Mom," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. Around them, people murmured in awe. That kid just out-argued a professional attorney. Unbelievable, an 18-year-old just changed the course of this case. Martin West looked like a fool up there. Even some of the jurors who had previously dismissed him as nothing more than a stubborn teenager now nodded with respect. They had seen something remarkable unfold today, something they would remember for years to come. Then, amidst the scattered applause and the growing whispers, Judge Harrison did something no one expected. He stood from the bench and stepped down. The courtroom hushed once more as he walked toward Noah, his expression unreadable. For a long moment, he simply regarded the young man before him. Then, slowly, he extended his hand. "Mr. Reynolds," the judge said, his deep voice carrying a weight of sincerity, "I owe you an apology." Noah blinked, caught off guard. Judge Harrison exhaled, his tone softer than before. "When you walked into this courtroom, I misjudged you. I assumed you were wasting my time, that you were just another young man too reckless for his own good. But today, you reminded me of something I should never have forgotten. Justice isn't about age, background, or wealth. It's about truth. And you, Mr. Reynolds, fought for the truth with more courage than some lawyers display in their entire careers." Lisa let out a small sob, covering her mouth with her hands. Noah, feeling the gravity of the moment, took a steady breath and shook the judge's hand firmly. "Thank you, Your Honor," he said, his voice unwavering. The judge gave him a small nod. "If you ever decide to pursue law, I'd be honored to write your first letter of recommendation." A murmur of astonishment swept through the gallery. Even Martin West, who was still sitting at his table, rubbing his temples in frustration, glanced up in disbelief. Reporters wasted no time. Microphones were suddenly in Noah's face, cameras flashing, voices overlapping. "Noah Reynolds. How does it feel to have won against a seasoned attorney? What's next for you? Are you planning to study law?" Noah glanced at his mother, who still held on to his hand like she never wanted to let go. He turned back to the reporters, exhaling. "It was never about winning," he said. "It was about standing up for my mom, for what's right. People like us, we don't always get the chance to fight back. But that doesn't mean we don't deserve justice." The crowd murmured, some nodding in agreement. One of the reporters pressed forward. "Does this mean you'll be pursuing law in the future?" Noah hesitated. Just a few months ago, the thought of becoming a lawyer had never crossed his mind. But now, as he looked around at the courtroom that had once felt so hostile, he realized something. He belonged here. A slow smile tugged at his lips. He turned, his gaze falling on the courthouse walls, the towering pillars that had once seemed like barriers but now felt like possibilities. "One day," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else, "I'll come back. Not as a defendant. Not as an underdog. But as a lawyer." Lisa sucked in a breath, her eyes wide. "Noah," she whispered. He turned back to her, squeezing her hand. "I know you will," she said, pride shining in her tear-filled eyes. With that, they turned toward the doors, stepping out into the bright midday sun. The moment they emerged from the courthouse, cheers erupted from the small crowd gathered outside. Friends, neighbors, and strangers who had followed their case clapped and whistled in celebration. "You did it, kid." Noah Reynolds, the lawyer of the people. Someone pressed a loaf of warm, freshly baked bread into Lisa's hands. "For celebrating," the woman said warmly. Lisa held it close, her throat tight with emotion. Noah took a deep breath, looking out at the faces around him, people who had doubted him, people who had supported him, people who needed someone like him. As he and his mother began walking home, their steps felt lighter than they had in months. Noah wasn't just walking away from the courthouse. He was walking toward his future. And for the first time in his life, he knew exactly where he was going.